thank you all for coming out here. It's a wonderful privilege to be here. I've been to many of Jeannie's soul food salons already, and it's almost an honor to be at the season finale of sorts, and definitely feel that a lot of pressure to make it a good ending to a great season. Jeannie, thank you so much for doing this and having us here. Look forward to many more of these talks in the future. I also wanted to point out to you guys, at the front here, we have a couple of pamphlets. Please feel free to take one. This is a neat little summary of a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about. In there, you'll find what we've called the Brain Food Challenge, which is a nice recap of a lot of the points that we're going to be discussing today. And one of the challenges is to try to do this for about 2 weeks. Some of the things that I'm going to be discussing today, and we encourage everybody to do it, complete the form, and if you want, take a picture and turn it in. And share your results, and by all means, this is an interactive session, and much in the same spirit, this is an interactive exercise. So if you have any feedback as to which of these things that we're going to discuss today works well or doesn't, let us know. The other thing you're going to find in this packet is kind of a very brilliant technological revelation called earplugs. And the funny thing is so my wife and I are big fans of earplugs, almost to the point where we joke that nobody's going to hear the baby crying in the middle of the night. We have silicone earplugs, and I have to tell you, one of the biggest things that I find is silence is so important for sleep. And even in the Bay Area, there tends to be a lot of noise and airplanes and cars and things like that. The technological revelation here is we've taken silicone earplugs and split them in half. The biggest problem I found with a lot of people for whom I recommend earplugs is they end up taking the whole thing and trying to stuff it in their ears, and it's just too damn big, it's falling out, no good. So we cut them in half. We're going to start a company that does that. So please, by all means, grab a pamphlet, use the earplugs, and get some good sleep at minimum. If there's anything you take home from this talk today, it's like just get some good sleep, because that'll go a long way. A little bit about me. I grew up in Queens. I was playing with an Apple IIe computer by the age of 8. I won the New York State Math Fair by the age of 11. And I've always been sort of a geek. But at the same time, I kind of loved medicine. And I was drawn to medicine. I loved working with people. And it was always interesting for me to see, how psychology affects our daily lives. But by the same token, I also kind of like computers. So I figured the perfect synthesis of that was actually psychiatry. So I did my training in New York and in Stony Brook University in psychiatry, and then I went on to do the sleep fellowship. To me, sleep was always like just the other half of psychiatry in many ways. It's such an important piece of all of our lives. It's used as an excuse, why do people spend so much money on a mattress? Well, because you spend 8 hours a day at minimum in it. So hugely important aspect of our lives that impacts everything. We're going to get a little bit into that in this discussion. So getting started, the human brain is this fascinating, it's a 3-pound organ. It's really not that big. In there, you have about 100,000 miles of blood vessels. It's very relevant to the soul food talks. It's a very energy-hungry organ. The human brain uses about 20 to 25% of the total calories that we consume. That huge energy burden is believed to be one of the reasons why humans actually invented cooking. Cooking actually there's a theory that cooking has enabled us to actually take in a higher caloric intake than animals and other species that aren't able to cook. And this has actually allowed our brains to grow and has allowed us to kind of develop this frontal cortex that we have. One of the ways we're going to conceptualize the brain is it's sort of like a forest. And really, it's a forest of about 100 billion trees. If you can imagine that just for a second, 100 billion is a very huge number. There's about 300 billion stars in our galaxy. You have 100 billion neurons in this little 3-pound computer in your head. Each of these trees or neurons, they have about either between 1,000 to 10,000 branches. These are called synapses. And these are like all interconnections between the various trees. So a good way to look at this talk today is kind of like, see your brain as sort of a canopy, a densely interwoven canopy with a lot of connections. That number, I think, is something like 10 trillion, which is the total number of synaptic connections in your brain. We're born with most of these connections at birth, and through life we'll lose about 10% of them. So in reality, you're pretty much born with all the trees you're going to have. What does change over time is the synaptic connections, and we'll talk about that briefly. One of the really cool things about the brain is the way that it's lateralized. It always fascinated me. They do believe that there is a left and right lateralization in the brain. Most right-handed people, about 95% of them, will have their language centers on the left side of their brain. You know, the left side of your brain is sort of more analytical, critical. It's the language center. It's specific, it's linear, it's categorical. It's the part of your brain that tells you, I got to go to the store and get bananas, and I got to stop by and pick up my laundry on the way there. The right side of your brain is more the Democrat, whereas the left side is the Republican. And the right side of your brain is more holistic, pictorial, intuitive, empathic. And this is just a very interesting separation of functions within the brain. A great talk. How many of you have seen the Jill Bolt Taylor talk on A Stroke of Insight? She writes an excellent book about this. If you guys haven't seen this, you really should. Maybe we'll put a link up for it on my website. But Jill Bolt Taylor, she's a neuroanatomist at Harvard. And she knows the brain better than anybody else. And this lady in 1996 experiences a pretty large stroke in her left hemisphere. Again, just to recap, the left hemisphere is the critical one, the one that tends to kind of count, measure, plan, predict. And that's exactly the part of her brain that gets affected. What ends up happening is that with the left critical part of her brain shut down, the right part just flourishes. And the experiences she has after this, I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about this, and I'll share some of these quotes with you. So basically what ends up happening is the critical part of her brain gets shut down. She describes in her talk that at one point she tries to dial the phone, and she's unable to actually pick out the numbers on the phone. She's dialing the numbers by recognizing pictures rather than thinking that that's a number 7. And then when she actually gets on the phone to call her friend, she's unable to communicate. Why? Because the left side of her brain was affected by the stroke. So in some ways you could say that the left side of her brain was a little bit impaired still, and the right side was a bit disinhibited. And out of the right side just flourished this beautiful experience that I'm going to describe to you. So she describes, you know, as the language centers in my left hemisphere grew increasingly silent, I became detached from the memories of my life. I was comforted by an expanding sense of grace. In this void of higher cognition and details pertaining to my normal life, my consciousness soared into an all-knowingness, a being at one with the universe, if you will. This is that left-sided disconnection, the right-sided brain disconnection. It's a disconnection of the ego, basically. So she's sort of like free, and she's discussed that the boundaries between her and the outer world were blurred. In some ways, it's as though the left brain is the side of the brain that tells you, you know, you are you and I am me. The right side of the brain is the part that says, you know, we are all part of this kind of interwoven cosmic web. She goes on to describe a state of nirvana. She says, as the fibers of my left hemisphere shut down, they no longer inhibited my right hemisphere. My perception was free to shift, such that my consciousness could embody the tranquility of my right mind. Swathed in an enfolding sense of liberation and transformation, the essence of my consciousness shifted. I'm no authority, but I think the Buddhists would say I entered a mode of existence they call nirvana. I think that's kind of amazing. The fact that, you know, we all have this capability within us is really incredible. And in her case, I mean, unfortunately, it took a stroke to bring this out. But it is interesting to see what our minds are capable of. So how does this canopy of trees develop? One of the really interesting things to realize is that humans are born relatively helpless compared to other species. If you think about it, most baby goats and baby deer can do pretty much 80 to 90% of their full lifetime function within the first few hours of birth. Deer are able to walk within 4 hours. Not much different for baby goats and other animals. Humans, on the other end, are born with these big floppy heads that take up about 1/3 of our bodies. We do have all these neurons present at birth, but the truth is that they're not really doing anything for at least the first few months of life. Humans are completely helpless for the first few years of life. And actually, this process of maturation continues for probably the first 26 years of life. The important thing to realize is that most of these neurons, we are born with the forest. The forest is there. There are 86 to 100 billion neurons are present. The branches haven't grown yet. And that's the process called synaptogenesis. And this is really the amazing part of how our brains develop. What ends up happening from the time of birth through about the time of puberty is you have this explosion of tree branches. The brain is sort of testing out all these different connections. If you want to use the analogy of the rainforest, it's sending out little shoots everywhere to see where's there water, where's there sunlight. And it sort of overgrows. And then around puberty, there's what's called a massive decline in these synapses. And what the brain literally does here, the number of neurons doesn't change, but what the brain does do is it decides which synapses are important and which synapses are not. And the synapses that are important end up staying, and those that aren't end up going. And you have about a 30 to 40% drop in the number of synapses around the time of puberty. This explains a lot of the things that you guys may have seen before, which is why it's so easy to pick up a language as a young child. I've also noticed people I work with, whenever somebody comes from a foreign country, if you came here before puberty, you don't have the accent. If you learned the language before puberty, the accent is gone. If you learn the language after, you're always going to talk with a bit of an accent. And this is the reason why. With respect to the neurons in the brain, the number of neurons we have generally remains stable through our lifetimes. There's a small decline at around 10% over the course of our lives, but they do generally survive. The number of synapses does begin to decline with life, usually past the age of 55. The other thing I should mention is myelination, and that really happens until the age of 26. What is myelination? So your neurons, in addition to having their branches and all this interconnection, the shoots have to work quickly. Myelin is like a layer of fat that surrounds neurons, and it allows them to function at about 100 times their speed if they're not myelinated. The process is interesting. It starts with your lower feet as a baby. Part of the reason babies can't walk is because their lower neurons aren't myelinated yet. What that ends up meaning is information about your position, where you are, how you're standing, doesn't travel back to the brain fast enough in a fashion so that your brain can respond and correct and you don't fall. So this is fascinating. This is the reason why we're able to walk, usually around 1 year of age. And the process of myelination starts down at your toes and it moves up through your body. And one of the last places to get myelinated is your prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is really what sets humans apart from a lot of other species. It lets us do the amazing things that we do, build skyscrapers and put a man on the moon. One of the interesting things about myelination is it's really not complete until about age 26. And as many of you know, your kids' auto insurance policies tend to also drop off in rates around this time. And it makes perfect sense. Because in reality, until your prefrontal cortex is myelinated, you do tend to do impulsive things. You may not think through things as long as you would if your frontal cortex was myelinated. I just think it's funny that the insurance companies figured this out a long time ago. So we have this beautiful, canopy of trees in our minds, with 100 billion neurons and all interconnected with these 100 trillion connections. And the question becomes, what can we do to nourish this forest? You know what I mean? And what we're going to be talking about today is really a lot of dietary intervention and lifestyle interventions that are good for the trees. One of the biggest things that the crux of this talk is BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. In its simplest form, BDNF is a protein that, number one, nourishes the connections that are there, and it encourages new connections to form. This is huge because if you think of your brain as this forest, it's important to kind of keep it's important to keep the connections going. Ideally, it's also important to sprout some new connections. And there is evidence that parts of our brain, before we always thought that the brain has these, 100 billion neurons and that's it. But there is evidence that there is new neurons being formed constantly in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a tremendously important part of your brain. The hippocampus is responsible for short-term memory, declarative memory, and spatial orientation. To sum that up, that's tremendously important. The hippocampus stores data in short term that lets you commit it to long term. It also helps you orient yourself in space. One of the first things to go with a lot of Alzheimer's and a lot of neurodegenerative processes is the hippocampus. There's evidence that in depression, the hippocampus suffers. And to no surprise, the hippocampus is one of the main regions that relies on this BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, to encourage new neuron growth and synapse formation. So there's evidence that BDNF will improve neuron survival, differentiation. It helps with synaptic plasticity. This is the process of learning something new, your brain taking on a new task. It's been shown higher levels of BDNF are associated with diminished rates of cognitive decline. There's evidence that when there's low levels of BDNF, you do get atrophy of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really the first part to go. It's so sensitive, it's so active, that as soon as there's any kind of insult, as soon as the forest isn't getting enough rain, that's really the first part to go. And the problem is that this is such an essential part. Depression, by the way, is another condition in which you do have atrophy of the hippocampus, and that is believed to be associated through BDNF. The other thing I wanted to touch upon briefly, because this is a soul food salon talk, is that there's increasing evidence of a brain-gut connection. And what's really fascinating is that there's evidence, so your vagus nerve goes from your brain down to your gut. There is evidence that BDNF is produced in the highest quantities in the part of the brain where the vagus nerve is connected. And this opens up a huge new world of possibilities where the foods you eat and the state of your gut may actually influence the production of this BDNF and all the good things that happen when you have enough of it. So there's a couple of BDNF boosters. We're going to talk about all of these in detail today. Exercise is one of them. Eating healthy, restricting calories, sunlight. There's theories that changes in sunlight actually affect BDNF levels, and this may be a reason why you have things like seasonal affective disorder. There's people that get depressed in the wintertime. And part of the theory there is that because of these lower levels of BDNF, your brain sort of gets hardwired into a depressed state. Learning new stuff. I can't stress enough. I mean, the studies show that it can be as simple as brushing your teeth with your left hand, taking a new route home, doing something different, getting off of autopilot can have a tremendous benefit. It basically tells your brain, hey, something's changing, we need to adapt to this. So the more comfortable you get, the less BDNF you're making, which in the long run isn't so good. We'll talk about turmeric and the active component curcumin. The other thing I wanted to mention is psychiatric medications. There is evidence that a lot of psychiatric meds, beyond just like boosting serotonin and norepinephrine and all the neurotransmitters, that in reality these medications are boosting BDNF. And getting back to the thing about the seasonal affective disorder, what one theory is that, again, in a depressed state, your brain gets hardwired into that state. And one of the key things to do there is just to put some miracle grow on the trees and let the trees try to rewire in a different way. There's evidence that, and you can get that from therapy, and you can also get that from just lifestyle changes, but that sort of allows the brain to rewire. The theory is that when we're depressed, we're stuck in a state, and this lets that change. One thing I wanted to touch upon is also lithium. Lithium is a very interesting substance. It's actually an element. It's number 3 on the periodic table. Everybody always hears lithium. It has such a bad connotation. It's like, ooh, you think of like, oh, this is a very heavy psychiatric medication. And in reality, it is. It's also a naturally occurring element. There was a great New York Times piece that recently, so they looked at these giant swaths of land between, I think it was Denmark and Japan. And, lithium occurs in the groundwater. And I think there's actually in Portland, there's a Lithia Springs where people go to like fill their jugs with lithiated water. But anyway, so they looked at these giant swaths of land and they looked at the amount of lithium in the tap water. And what they found is that in places where there's more lithium, people reported lower rates of depression, lower rates of domestic violence, and greater overall happiness. And I think that's fascinating. It's important to realize that, much like magnesium or calcium, we shouldn't exactly say that, a certain element we should ban from our diet. And I'm not telling everybody out there to go on lithium, but there is evidence that a trace amount can actually have a very positive role. Let's talk a little bit about exercise. There's evidence that, the more people exercise and the higher fitness score they have, the better executive function they have a faster processing speed, and they have a higher volume of their hippocampus. It's so easy, it's so natural. A lot of this talk, I think in the end boils down to a couple of key points, but exercise is one of them. What's interesting is they've shown that really harder exercise is actually better for you than just kind of going to the gym and doing aerobics for 45 minutes. Specifically, they've shown that running, swimming, cycling with a higher intensity can actually boost BDNF levels threefold in comparison to doing something more. There was a Cochrane review in 2014 that also showed that there's an antidepressant effect to exercise, and if you combine exercise with an antidepressant regimen, people do much better. Again, it all loops back to BDNF. You're encouraging this rewiring and regrowth of brain cells. They've shown that people that exercise more intensely remember better. Georgia Institute of Technology, they took a group, they let them work out intensely for 20 minutes, they looked at photos, and then they tested them how much they could recall. The group that exercised intensely had much better recall. They were able to recall about 60% of the pictures that they had seen. Another article in the Journal of Neurobiology of Learning and Memory showed that an intense bout of cycling boosted BDNF levels. They taught these people new skills, and these people were able to remember these skills better at 1 hour, 24 hours, and 7 days later. This is just exercise, guys. This is nothing complicated. And it's, okay, intense exercise. Exercise also reverses brain atrophy. So if you recall that graph that was showing you how many neurons we have, there's evidence that after the age of 55, you tend to lose 1 to 2% of the volume of that hippocampus every year. They had people in there over 55 involved in regular aerobic exercise, and what they were able to show is these people increased their hippocampal volume by 2% per year. That's a tremendous improvement, and that's something so critical at a later stage in life when you do need that hippocampus more than ever. Exercise is also able to reverse stress-related decreases in the hippocampal volume. So it has many, many positive effects. In thinking about, what is intense exercise, one of the easiest rules to follow, how many of you know what your target heart rate is and how to calculate that? Anyone? It's pretty simple, actually. It's 225 minus your age, and then you take 70% of that. So in the case, if you're 40 years old, you're looking at a heart rate of about 130. If you're 60 years old, you're looking at a heart rate of about 115. And again, most of the studies support between 20 to 30 minutes of intense exercise. The more the better. If you can do it every day, good for you, but there's evidence that even 3 times a week has a positive beneficial role. There's also foods that boost BDNF. The polyphenols, these are the colorful fruits, vegetables, spices. These give plants their bitter taste. They're strong antioxidant properties, and they also boost BDNF. Resveratrol, found in grape skins and wine, can do the same thing. Chlorogenic acid, found in plums, apples, cherries, and also coffee beans. Beyond just boosting BDNF, it's been shown to actually decrease anxiety behavior in mice. It's shown to have neuroprotective properties, lowering, increasing insulin sensitivity, and also reducing rates of colon cancer. The take-home point from this part of the talk is really just, eat healthy. And we'll talk about the diet a little more later, but really exercise hard. If you're going to go to the gym and you're going to put the time in, put in a little bit of intensity. If it's even 20 minutes as part of your workout, and you will remember better, and chances are you will ward off a lot of brain atrophy that may occur through life. So let's talk a little bit about curcumin. Curcumin is a phenol. It's what makes turmeric yellow. It's been used since 1900 BC for various illnesses, and it's a very potent BDNF activator. It's also it does so many good things. I mean, the list goes on and on. I can think of one good reason not to take curcumin, and that's really like if you have any risk of bleeding disorders, it can prolong your bleeding times. There's some evidence that if you have gallstone disease, gallbladder disease, it may not be the right medicine for you. But besides that, it will do everything from lowering, it's an antioxidant, anti-cancer agent. It has antiviral properties, and it also is very good for the brain. They've done studies in mice. We'll be talking a bit about mice during this talk, and they've shown that the effects of curcumin are actually comparable to imipramine, and imipramine is a pretty potent antidepressant. And what they've shown is that these mice were exposed to chronic stress for 20 days, and the mice that were exposed to curcumin before actually did as well as the mice that were treated with an antidepressant. In traumatic brain injury, they've done all sorts of cruel things to mice, but among them, they've found that pre-medicating mice with curcumin greatly improves their rate of recovery and overall brain health following a traumatic brain injury. There's also a theory and some speculation, in India that you have the lowest rates of Alzheimer's. And one of the theories to explain that is that in India you have the largest consumption of turmeric. There was a great prior soul food talk that brought up curcumin. The beauty of this particular type of curcumin is the small particle size. One of the problems with turmeric and curcumin, and when you eat it, it tends not to cross the GI system very easily into the blood. It tends to stay in the gut, actually. There's some evidence that eating it with black pepper can enhance that absorption, but even beyond that, reducing the particle size of the curcumin to about 1/10 or 100th of its size makes it way more water-soluble and way more readily cross the gut barrier and also the blood-brain barrier. So it's kind of getting to where you need it to be. The recommended dose of curcumin is about between 300 to 900 milligrams per day. In this graph, they talk about the bioavailability, which shows you just the huge spike in blood levels of curcumin if you're taking the smaller particles of curcumin. Besides Integrative Therapeutics, there are some other companies that are beginning to make curcumin, and I should say that that's probably the best mode by which to get your curcumin. In a nutshell, this is the difference between curcumin and curcumin. The smaller particle, this is actually a video you can find online, but what happens is the smaller particles just let it dissolve way more easily through water. And that actually results in it getting absorbed by your body much better, bioavailability. Let's talk a little bit about green tea, because this is another thing that, there's a lot of evidence that shows that there may be significant benefits to this. The compound in green tea that's believed to have all these beneficial properties is a word that I challenge all of you to pronounce with me. It's epigalactotecan gallate. Epigalactotecan gallate, EGCG. It's been used in China. Green tea has been drank in China for over 4,000 years. It's believed to be a more potent stimulator of BDNF even than the resveratrol that you have in red wine. A University of Kansas study looked at green tea, and they found it to be, this compound actually, in green tea, and they found it to be 100% more effective than vitamin C, 25 times more potent than vitamin E in protecting cellular DNA. So irrespective of what it's doing to BDNF, which there is evidence it's doing a lot actually, it's an antioxidant and it's protecting your DNA, which in the long run is also a very positive effect. They've shown that frequent green tea consumption has resulted in a lower incidence of cognitive disorders in Japan. They took 1,000 elderly Japanese people, and they all had them, and they adjusted for variables such as cardiovascular disease or diabetes, and they followed them for a couple of months, and what they found is that if you consume more green tea, you have less depression. And that critical number of how much green tea in a day is about 4 cups per day. And in the group that was consuming that amount, they noticed that there was a 44% lower incidence of depression than in people that were consuming about 1 cup per day. So the take-home point number 2 is green and yellow is the easy way to conceptualize is get your green tea and also get your curcumin, because the benefits are tremendous. The cost of I look at all of these recommendations as what's the cost of doing that, and in reality the price of drinking green tea 2 to 3 cups a day is relatively minor. You're gonna get tea, just might as well get green tea or get the Lipton tea. And curcumin, the benefits are just tremendous, and the downsides are relatively low. There's a site that actually reviews the amount of EGCG in various teas, and Lipton actually turned out to be higher than most bagged green teas. Yeah, Lipton. So let's talk also about omega-3 fatty acids. These are tremendously important. They make up about 8% of our brain weight. They have a strong anti-inflammatory, antioxidant properties. There's evidence that deficiencies of omega-3s have tremendous psychiatric and neurological effects. You're looking at higher rates of ADHD, dyslexia, dementia, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, dementia, and Alzheimer's. Omega-3s are long-chain, there's 2 types of long-chain fatty acids, and these are also difficult words to pronounce. It's eicosapentaenoic acid, that's EPA, and docosahexaenoic acid, DHA. They look like this, and they're called PUFAs. PUFAs because they're polyunsaturated fatty acids. And what that means in plain English, if you guys remember your chemistry at all, here you have a bunch of little hydrogens and there's no double bonds. This is a saturated fatty acid, and these are polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're called polyunsaturated because they have several areas where they're unsaturated, and that's these double bonds. On the top you see EPA, and on the bottom you see DHA, and those are really the 2 important types of omega-3s that we're going to be talking about. 2 long-chain omega-3s we're going to talk about is EPA and DHA. EPA is huge. It's important, and its levels of EPA have been associated with things like childhood behavior, academic performance. Levels will correlate with things like focus, attention, as well as depression. EPA has the ability to lower LDL. It's also a strong anti-inflammatory effect, which is an overall very positive health benefit from EPA. DHA is involved in children very actively. It's involved in brain growth, retina development. It's present in breast milk, and that's how babies actually get a lot of their DHA. In adults, it's been shown to improve cognition and working memory. They've shown that adolescents that have a low fish intake that were supplemented with about 1,000 milligrams a day of DHA for 6 months showed an improved memory retention and reaction time after 6 months of treatment. In older humans, they've shown that higher DHA levels in serum are associated with improved verbal fluency. That's just improved the word finding difficulty that comes with age gets better if you're treated with DHA. It's also been shown to reduce triglycerides as well as increase HDL, which is the good form of cholesterol. So omega-3, has been associated with intelligence and cognitive performance in infancy and childhood. There's a couple of really cool studies, they gave, so 1.5 grams, you were asking about EPA and DHA, 1.5 grams of the 2 were used in this study. So you're looking at 840 milligrams of EPA, 700 milligrams of DHA. They use these in autistic children, and this reduced tantrums, reduced aggression, and reduced self-injurious behaviors. They took stressed but healthy normal volunteers. They treated them with 1,500 milligrams of EPA and DHA, well, DHA in this case, and they had an overall improved stress tolerance and reaction to stress. There's also evidence that this is pertinent to my field of work, that using these omega-3 fatty acids improves response to antidepressants. They used EPA in this case, 1,000 milligrams. So the response to an antidepressant alone was 50%, EPA alone was 56%, together 81%, which is a tremendous gain.
It's a lot of pills.
It is a lot of pills. I will tell you right now how many pills that is exactly. So one of the form that I use often with my patients, we use Nordic Naturals omega-3 fatty acids. and it's interesting. So how many of you guys ever stopped and looked at actually how many milligrams are you getting of the omega-3s here? So this is what you were asking. So per, a serving here is 2 soft gels, and in that you're getting 330 of EPA and 220 of DHA. That's a total of about 550 milligrams of omega-3 just from those 2 pills, which is kind of low compared to what a lot of the studies look at. Most of the studies look at between 500 and 1,000 milligrams of each. I have found studies that will go as high as up to 3,000 milligrams or even 6,000 milligrams of omega-3 supplementation, fairly well tolerated, with relatively few side effects. And again, benefit to things like depression and neuronal function. One of the things I want to point out is also a 6-ounce piece of Atlantic non-farm raised salmon. And you have it there for scale with a battery and a $10 bill. That's got 883 grams of EPA and 1,000 milligrams of DHA. There's a lot of evidence that actually getting your omega-3s from fish is really the best way to go. A lot of the studies show that besides just omega-3s, there's a lot of other things you're getting in fish that you're not getting in the supplements. To answer your question a little also, you're getting vitamin D, selenium, protein, among other things, and there's a lot of other fatty fish oils that are there. And there's evidence that a lot of these other constituents in fish actually greatly improve the absorption and bioavailability also of the omega-3s that you're consuming. There was one interesting study that showed that eating DHA, following DHA levels 6 weeks after eating just salmon were 9 times higher than in comparison to fish oil. So going back to doing it the natural way is always the preferred way to go. If you can avoid the supplements and just eat the real thing 3 times a week, 2 to 3 servings of 6-ounce salmon per week is almost adequate to meet your omega-3 needs. And also to summarize this take-home point, this article I stumbled on like just a few days ago. This was published, I think, April 28th of this year. And basically, they looked at, again, people that were following a Mediterranean diet, and they tried to tease apart which part of it was really causing this link to larger brain volume, and it did turn out to be the fish. The fish part had the highest, association with this increase in brain volume that you see. Take-home point number 3 is eat your fish. It's that simple. 6 ounces 2 to 3 times a week is already a good start. And if you're going to take your supplements, take them with olive oil. There's evidence that, again, taking it with other fats helps the absorption, actually, of these omega-3s. So we're going to shift gears a little bit about, so we talked about the different foods and different things that can nourish the forest. Let's talk about now some of the natural rhythms of the forest. As a sleep doctor, one of the things we think about a lot is the circadian rhythm. You guys know what circadian rhythms are, right? So these are the natural patterns. Most fundamentally, these were observed as periods of sleep and wake. You see these in every living thing on Earth, ranging from plants to mice to shrews to people. These rhythms play a very important role in how we perform, how we function, and how we respond to different interventions, like when we eat. One of the our body follows this rhythm throughout the day. Circadian rhythms are believed to be the reason that people tend to have heart attacks Monday mornings between the hours of 6 and noon. The reason we tend to have heart attacks in the morning is because our body kind of has this like surge of catecholamines and enzymes that kind of wake you up and get you going. For some of us, that wakes us up and that gets us going. For those of us that have any predisposition to heart disease, that can make that worse. Circadian rhythms is what drives us to sleep at night, to wake up in the morning. You have that sharp rise in blood pressure in the morning. Your melatonin starts to secrete in the evenings. Your body temperature peaks in the evenings. I'm not even going to get into this, but the decline in body temperature that goes on through the night enhances your sleep. And there's evidence that if you can actually warm yourself up before bed, the sharper the drop in temperature through the night, the deeper your sleep will be. So all these things are interconnected. What I'm going to be talking about, though, is how actually food plays a role in your circadian rhythms as well. The problem is we've ventured very far from our caveman and woman roots. There was a time when food was not readily abundant, and we would eat and we would starve. There were times when we wouldn't have food readily available. Interestingly, and we're going to get into this a little more, there's evidence that actually your brain actually secretes BDNF during times of starvation. It's kind of interesting. You almost think like the brain's trying to like figure out like, oh, what do we do to get food? But it's a known effect. So anyway, we live in a society of excess, as many of you know, and a lot of the diseases and disorders we see is because we're really not following the natural rhythms. We're not adhering in any way to the biological rhythms, the circadian rhythm, which I mentioned. So, typically everyone always thought that circadian rhythms were controlled by light and day. There's an amazing study by a well-known sleep researcher, Cliff Saper, who actually found that food can play an equally important part in regulating our sleep and wake, which makes perfect evolutionary sense if you think about it. To survive, sure, it's important maybe to sleep at night. In the case of mice, this is reversed, or be awake during the day, but it's also equally important to be awake when there's food, and perhaps to sleep when there isn't. What he found in his studies is he's actually better able to control mouse sleep-wake cycles based on feeding schedules. He concludes that basically, if animals have access to food only during their normal sleep cycle, they will shift most of their circadian rhythms to match food availability. This is huge. In this same paper, he talks about the possibility of applying this to jet lag. One of the things he mentioned is the possibility, while you're flying, not to eat anything. A period of fasting while you're flying, and to eat a meal as soon as you get there. And what essentially that does, that's, at least according to the mouse models, that was able to entrain you to the local time zone about 3 to 5 days faster. It makes sense. Another interesting study looked at mice. So they gave them, they had 2 sets of mice. They were both eating the same number of calories for a period of 38 weeks. But one group was able to eat whenever they wanted, like your typical Western lifestyle. The other group was confined to an eating window of either 8 hours or 12 hours. Which group do you guys think gained weight, and which group do you guys think ended up thin and lean? Confined eating, actually. The mice that were limited to this schedule were actually leaner, healthier, metabolic profiles were much better than the mice that could eat all the time. And the amazing thing is that this is the same number of calories. Nothing's changed. And the mice were, by the way, they were allowed to cheat on the weekends a little bit. They treated them well. So you can't cheat on the weekends. So there's evidence that fasting and caloric restriction play a huge role in boosting BDNF. And this is what I was hinting at before, that it could be your brain is trying to figure out, what do we do to get food? What different thing could I do to obtain food during a period of starvation? There's evidence that caloric restriction and fasting will enhance cardiovascular and brain function. In mice, it enhanced resistance to injury from infarct and stroke. There's evidence that it can reverse some of the changes seen in neurodegenerative diseases. The net gain in terms of brain volume and function has almost been compared to those intense periods of exercise. So there's some theory that the starvation and exercise may actually be a convergent pathway, converging possibly on BDNF. Both caloric restriction and intermittent fasting have been shown to actually improve, beyond just metabolic indices, insulin sensitivity. There's a huge role there. Again, most of the studies look at either skipping days, skipping meals, or skipping, or just eating within certain confined periods of time. There's also an alternate day fasting regimen, and in that one, you eat normally on one day, and on the second day, you eat only 25% of your typical caloric intake. Fasting in general, it sort of puts your brain and your body into this survival mode, which the level of antioxidants that your body naturally produces, brain-derived neurotropic factor, your body has actually quite a surprisingly positive response to intermittent starvation. And really, if we could miss one meal in 3, or eat less one day than the other, there could be tremendously beneficial results. So the take-home point number 4 is really, it's easy enough. Contain your eating to 12 hours a day. It's not so hard to do. Dr. Panda, who did that mouse study where they got to eat all the time or none of the time, really says the clock starts with your first cup of coffee in the morning. So think about that. The next time you're eating, just realize when you had your first meal, and when 8 o'clock rolls around, it'll do you an exponential amount of good to skip that midnight snack, to skip that 10 p.m. snack, from a weight loss standpoint, from a metabolic standpoint, and also from a brain health standpoint. This scheduled eating also beautifully ties into that thing that I was telling you guys about the jet lag also. It's important, you should realize that late night snack ties into the possibility that late night snack might actually be shifting your circadian rhythm and making your sleep worse during the night. We're going to keep going further now into the world of sleep. Again, when we were cavemen and women, we had a lot more opportunity to sleep. And there was no artificial light, you know what I mean? We were more grounded biologically before the advent of artificial light. Sleep has its own rhythms, and without boring you guys with too many of the details, the main things to realize about sleep is that there's 2 important types. There's REM sleep and there's slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep happens in the beginning of the night. Slow wave sleep usually happens, till about 3 a.m. A lot of people will wake up at 3 a.m. for no clear reason and have trouble going back to sleep. Slow wave sleep is exactly what it sounds like. Your brain goes through these beautiful 4 hertz waves during the night, beautiful brain's neuronal synchrony. Slow wave sleep, when you wake up, is those times when you're staring at the alarm clock and you're like, what time is this? You can't make sense of the alarm. REM sleep happens more towards the morning. REM sleep is the dream sleep that everybody's heard about. It's the reason why when the alarm wakes you in the morning, you tend to dream more. What's interesting is that these types of sleep play a huge role in memory function and consolidation. They've done these amazing studies, again, on mice, where they've connected electrodes to their brain, followed them through a maze, and then they watch the mouse as the mouse sleeps. And guess what the mouse is doing in its sleep? The mouse is replaying parts of the maze. What's interesting is that in slow wave sleep, it's taking little snapshots of different parts of the maze. So it's almost like locking in, okay, this is this corner, this is that corner. In REM sleep, it's actually rehearsing the maze. There's evidence that it's actually sequentially going through different parts of the maze, practicing. And the mice that get more REM sleep solve the maze better the next day. And the people do as well. So sleep, is involved in everything from language to, executive function, divergent thinking, creativity, attention. And they've actually shown that, napping even, getting a little bit of REM sleep can improve your performance on things like word recall or solving a maze or learning a new task. Really neat stuff. So they had people learn to navigate their way through a maze. They napped 90 minutes. Those that dreamt did better after their nap. They had people memorize word pairs, nap 45 minutes. Those that did well before did even better after the nap. This was irrespective of dream sleep. And what was really amazing is they showed that even as short as a 6-minute snooze can improve word recall in patients that were tested. They basically have you memorize a list of words, you get a 6-minute nap, and you did much better if you had that opportunity to sleep. It also boosts immunity. During sleep, there's evidence that sleep-deprived people tend to have a higher rate of susceptibility to things like rhinovirus or the common cold. They've actually done these amazing studies where they'll give you like a creative problem. Like, think of the 10 different ways to solve this, this situation. They give you an opportunity to nap for 30 minutes or up to 45 minutes. The people that napped, especially the people that dreamed in their nap, so they actually went into REM sleep, did remarkably better. Better than coffee. Being sleep deprived also tends to make you overweight, and it increases your hunger. There's a protein called ghrelin. The way we remember is a ghrelin. It makes you hungry. Ghrelin is increased if you're sleep deprived. And there's clear metabolic consequences to lack of sleep. It can also improve your sex drive. There was a study that came out recently that showed women that slept an hour more a night had overall reported a 14% increase in their sexual drive. 14%, I'll take that. It's not too bad. And also, sleep is also involved in happiness. They, in Binghamton, they looked at 100 college kids. They asked them about, how much do you worry? How much negative thoughts do you have? And then they also asked them about sleep. And it turns out that the kids that sleep more had less negative thoughts, less repetitive negative thoughts if they got more sleep at night. So insomnia. This is a study by Roth, who's a prominent sleep researcher. Insomnia is actually a very dangerous neurologic thing. The association between insomnia and various psychiatric conditions is quite high. This is the difference in the incidence of things like depression, anxiety, alcohol use, and drug abuse in people, whether or not they had insomnia. And in the case of depression, I think it's almost like a 6-fold increase. It means a 6-fold increase in the likelihood of being depressed if you have insomnia. The same is anxiety is also a significant association. So you can see that, again, this ties into sleep because the lack of sleep does have significant ramifications, and we're all ignoring sleep, and it's so important. The reason we're all ignoring sleep is because of 2 things in our lives. Number one was the light bulb, invented by Edison in the 1890s. It's said that since the advent of artificial light, people on average sleep about 2 hours less per night. That's a huge amount of your sleep that's been lost. And then you have the modern day light bulb, which is your smartphone. There's not even a lot of studies out yet to show how much extra sleep we're losing because we're all finger skating during the night instead of sleeping. The way I conceptualize with a lot of the patients I work with is sleep is like a Chinese finger trap. And the problem with sleep is like the harder you try to pull on it, the worse it is. The person that's like, I have to wake up, I have to do this, I have to shower, there's a whole ritual. The harder you try to sleep, the worse you are at it. The beauty is if you can actually try to, the moment you let go and assume I'm gonna be okay, even if I sleep a little bit less tonight, I'll be all right, that's when it happens. It's hard to convince yourself that. Sometimes you need to hear it from a doctor. The numbers I'm about to show you will convince you that about 1 in 3 of you sitting in this room is a zombie. Because the reality is, between smartphones and light bulbs and all this technology, we are sleeping a lot less than we should be. And it has tremendous impacts. Everybody's very busy getting the latest supplement, taking that omega-3 that Alex talked about, and even, that's all great. But the fact is, if you're not sleeping enough, you're taking away one of the most fundamental things that could make you healthy and happy, and metabolically healthy and happy as well. The reality is, school-age children, they need about 10 hours of sleep. Teens need about 9 to 10 hours of sleep. They showed that only 31% of high school kids are sleeping sleeping more than 8 hours a night. What's even more disturbing, so for adults, you need about 7-8 hours of sleep is what's recommended. 30% of adults in America report that they sleep less than 6 hours a night. That's the 1 in 3 of you. Show of hands, who sleeps less than 7 hours a night in this room? Hello,
But is that
hello zombies.
continuous 7 hours,
Well, on
or is
average.
No, but is
Well,
that
in total,
like,
yeah, in total. In total. This is straight off of Wikipedia. You go online, sleep deprivation, boom, irritability, cognitive impairment, memory lapse, impaired moral judgment, yawning, hallucinations, symptoms similar to ADHD. That's a huge one. The number of kids I've seen when I was doing my sleep fellowship that come in way medicated and all kinds of stimulants and things like that, you look in their throat, they've got these giant tonsils. You find out that they're sleeping on 3 pillows and they're waking up 5 times a night. They're wetting their bed, they're talking in their sleep. You take the tonsils out and I'll never forget the moments like mom and dad come and hug you. Our kid's been off stimulants for the past 2 months, their ADHD is gone. Sleep primes your brain to learn and function and lock in memories, and if you're not getting enough of it for either behavioral reasons, because you're playing on your phone at night, or because you can't sleep well at night, there's going to be tremendous ramifications to that. Risk of diabetes type 2, increased reaction time, heart disease, and obesity. Signs of sleep deprivation. There's a very interesting spectrum that will go along. It begins with irritability, moodiness, and disinhibition. We've all seen that. But it can really get quite wacky. And let's not forget, sleep deprivation is actually a form of torture. So subjecting yourselves deliberately to less sleep has tremendous ramifications. You're looking at slowed speech, flattened emotional response, worsened memory, inability to do a novel task or to multitask. And when you get even further into sleep deprivation, your body must sleep. So you get into microsleep. Sometimes I've actually seen people with what's called hypnagogic hallucinations, where they'll actually hallucinate during the day. And what that is really that's the intrusion of dream sleep into your waking life. Your body is so desperate for sleep that you can be sitting there having a conversation, you will nod off for just even 3 seconds, and during that time you will actually start dreaming and have visual hallucinations in the room. Does anybody know how long caffeine lasts in your system? Yes, who said that? You're right. It has a 6-hour half-life. You guys know what that means? That means that in every 6 hours, whatever amount of caffeine you drank is about a half. So let's do the math. Let's say at noon you decided to have a venti. And you were done by noon because all of us chug the whole venti at once, right? We don't nurse it. So by noon if you had a venti, so a venti is 20 ounces of coffee, right? 20 ounces venti? So by 6 hours later, you're looking at 10 ounces of caffeine. So that's 6 p.m. 6 hours after that, by midnight, you're still looking at half of 10, 5 ounces of Starbucks coffee. Imagine for a second just what that means. That at midnight, you are drinking 5 ounces of Starbucks coffee. And that has tremendous impacts on your sleep. And generally people come to me and they brag. They'll say, oh, doc, I can drink a whole cup of coffee for dinner and sleep. But the reality is a lot of these people, they're tired the next day. They're also out there after that next cup of coffee, and so goes the coffee treadmill. A lot of the studies show that caffeine actually doesn't make you any smarter or sharper after you drink it. A lot of the positive benefits from caffeine actually result from the undoing of the caffeine withdrawal that you're going through. Just to really drive home the point of sleep deprivation, it's responsible for 100,000 crashes a year. You're looking at it's involved in 4% of fatal car crashes. What was really scary, they looked at adolescents. 1 in 10 said they nodded off in the past year while driving. 1 in 10. Half said they drove drowsy over the past year. 1/4 were in a near accident because of their sleepiness. And 28% admit to falling asleep at least once per week while in school. The terrible thing also that happens, everybody thinks teenagers are lazy, but the reality is that teenagers are shifted forward in terms of their sleep cycle. And what ends up happening is that schools, unfortunately, around the time of high school start earlier. And I think Menlo Atherton, or one of the schools around here, actually shifted to a later schedule. And what do you guess what? Like, kids are doing better, staying more awake in class, and test performance, I think, improved as well. Jeannie asked about, besides the amount of sleep fragmentation. So one of the things that, in my line of work is always fragment sleep. It's obstructive sleep apnea. Easy thing that upsets sleep. There was a study that came out now that was kind of fascinating. They found that people that have untreated sleep apnea have a 10-year earlier onset of neurocognitive impairment. 10 years. If your sleep is chronically fragmented for most of your life, you're looking at a 10-year earlier onset of neurodegenerative disease. And what was fascinating is that people that were treated with CPAP, that had their sleep apnea treated, actually had that reversed. To give some of you guys an idea, like how bad can sleep apnea disrupt your sleep? The patients I see will have like an apnea-hypopnea index of, let's say, between 15 and 30. 5 is the cutoff. But 15 and 30 is 15 to 30 times per hour. There's something breathing related that's waking you up during the night. 15 to 30 times an hour, that's almost once every 2 seconds. I've seen patients with an AHI of 60. An AHI of 60 means almost every minute something is waking you up during the night. Get more sleep. 7 or 8 hours a night is where you should all be aiming for. That's part of the challenges that you'll find on the table, and I advise, give it a try for 2 weeks. They've done studies. They've taken college kids and they said, get 1 more hour of sleep. Kids that were not tired, kids that did not have any complaints. And everybody within 2 weeks said they were feeling better, happier, and they thought they were more sharp and alert in class. Getting back to the Chinese finger trap thing, again, with the people, if you're laying in bed frustrated, angry, why can't I fall asleep? What time is it? That's the worst thing you could do. And it's the point where you're able to, ideally, again, you do want to lock in that the bed is for sleep. But beyond that, you also don't want to torture yourself. You don't want to become entrained that the bed is a place of stress, and I get uneasy, and I never sleep in there. That's a bad thing. So that's why we tell people, get out of bed, go sit on the couch, do something entertaining, but not solitaire, and not email, and because it is that finger trap again. The more you are in bed forcing it, the less likely it is to happen. Take a nap over coffee. The benefits are just as good. You'll consolidate memory, you'll prime your brain for learning, and there's way more benefits to just drinking caffeine. The last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is the default mode network, and there's been a lot of research into this. It turns out that your brain, even when it's doing nothing, is actually doing quite a bit, and we all take that for granted. There's increasing evidence that when you're bored, it's actually not so bad. Your brain, in reality, and we all have so little time to be bored these days, your brain, when it's bored, and this used to be back in the days before smartphones, you used to walk to your car, space out, you used to stand online, look at people. The reality is, like, the default mode network is active during these times. Your brain is actually 95% as active when you're bored as when you're actively doing something. And what your brain is doing during this time is, guess what? Rehearsing, practicing, and thinking. And what it's doing is it's actually considering, you're thinking about the conversation you had with your friend this morning, you're thinking about what you need to do at work, and this is all actually beneficial. More beneficial than checking your phone 221 times per day. This was a UK study that looked at average smartphone use in the general population. On average, they found that people will check their phones 221 times per day. We're all guilty of this here. Maybe I'm like 200, but not 221. That amounts to 3 hours and 16 minutes per day, 24 hours per week. That's a lot. That's a lot of time spent. And you wonder, like, what is the productivity gain from that? And I think we're sort of on the cusp of realizing that there is a point where there is too much technology and there is too much interruptions to our natural rhythms. 2013 Mobile Consumer Habits study found that 9% of people check their phone during sex. 35%. I wondered about that. Excuse me, honey. 35% in a movie theater, 33% on a dinner date, 32% at a child's function. Go figure. And 55% while driving. I mean, this is an epidemic, and it's just, I think it's just a matter of time before people really start appreciating the cost of using our devices so frequently. This isn't going to get any better with the iWatch and all these other things either. But I do think there's going to come a point where people realize that there's a net loss to this. The biggest thing everybody talks about mindfulness. The most important basis of mindfulness advice I could give everybody in this room is unplug. What you were saying about waking up in the morning, I've read actually several great articles that say, you wake up with a clear mind and your own agenda. Why do you immediately start checking email? What they say happens there is other people's agenda becomes your own. Instead of waking up with your own clear mind and your own, let your thoughts go where they may, you're immediately checking, email, messages, feeds, news, blah, blah, blah. And now basically that drive to work isn't really yours anymore. Now you're already thinking about somebody else's problems. So the really beneficial thing there is, the problem is your phone is your alarm clock. But the less things you can have appear on your home screen when 7 a.m., the better. They did this Bored and Brilliant challenge, and they basically, they told people to stop using your phone. And people came back saying that they just felt better, they felt they had deeper thinking, more creativity, and they were just feeling overall better rounded. Put your phone away, stop and look at your surroundings a little more often. Be consciously aware of spacing out. Since I read that Bored and Brilliant challenge, I almost found myself, there were times when I felt like using my phone. I was online at Starbucks. Shouldn't have been online at Starbucks in the first place. Should have been napping at home. And I catch myself, yeah, let me check my phone again. And then what was extremely amazing for me is the process of actively not using my phone. I almost felt like I deserve a treat. I was like, wow, that's cool. I actually I looked at the person online next to me. I deserve a cup of coffee for that. A venti, please. So I mean, let your brain do its thing. Your brain is this amazing organ. It knows when to eat, it knows when to sleep, and it knows when to just space out sometimes. And just getting that up-to-date email or text message isn't going to change anything. Be consciously aware of spacing out and appreciate those moments. And most importantly, think. God forbid, you have an opportunity to just sit there and think about something a little bit. It's not bad, or not think, or just stare. We should all stare for a minute. On the subject of mindfulness and meditation, just to touch the subject briefly, I catch myself guilty of this the same as maybe many of you. My wife always teases me. I'm always going to the self-help section. I'm always curious to read about Buddhism, Ayurvedic medicine, meditation, all this is great. But at some point I've realized it's almost better to just sit there and do it instead of reading another book about it. And I feel like, and I've seen this in the people I work with as well, too many of us are too caught up in, you got to read this book and go to this class, and I only like to meditate at that center. The truth is you can meditate right here, right now, if you just close your eyes and give yourself a chance to do that. And I think it's so important to just kind of give yourself that chance, read less about it, and just do it. Enough. Just try sitting in silence 10 minutes a day. Take the challenge. Do it. These challenges are all on there. Last point is, be mindful, put your phone down. And this kind of summarizes everything we talked about. This is all on that 2-week challenge, which encourages you to do these things as many times in this 2-week period as you can. You can write on that sheet how you felt before, how you felt after, and which of the interventions was the most helpful or least helpful for you. It's a work in progress, and I greatly value all of your opinions and your own experience as well. If we get back enough of these forms, we'll put them up on a site, and you can all read each other's forms. We'll keep it anonymous. So, I just want to thank everybody for this talk, and really, I love what I do. Thank you. Thank you so much.